Have you seen this man? U.S. Marshals and local authorities tell News 3 that 30-year-old Cola Beal is armed and dangerous.
Police in two Hampton Road cities believe he could be behind 3 murders in 5 days.
The string of murders all started when a house near Virginia Wesleyan University went up in flames. It's believed that Beal killed his 31-year-old girlfriend before allegedly setting her house on fire. The very next day, Beal was connected to another murder. A 71-year-old man who neighbors say Beal was close with was found dead from a gunshot. And then the very latest, just this Monday, Norfolk police found a man dead inside of his home on Sewells Point Road.
I came back and set the house on fire. I poured gasoline all over the house. So when I did the dog was getting burnt alive, so I was like, okay, I'll watch that because that funny.
A man suspected of killing 3 people in Norfolk and Virginia Beach is behind bars.
Beal is not really a stranger to the inside of a jail cell. He has a long criminal history that dates back all the way to 2005. Beal served prison time for armed robbery and sexual assault on a child. And in 2012, Beal pled guilty to several crimes, including conspiracy and 2 separate charges of robbery, including armed robbery and use of a firearm by a felon. Now, Beal served 6 years for those crimes, and he was on supervised probation.
Cola Beal's history is not that unusual when we put it in perspective with the histories of other people with severe psychopathy. In psychopathy, a person's view is primarily that they are unconstrained, that if they want something, nothing should really stand between them and their idea of achieving their goal. They just don't take other people's views into account, really. It's all about them and what they want.
I had a lot of build-up, man. The triggered me, man. She going through the present moment, keep calling her, talking about me, but it's crazy you don't respect somebody's relationship, and my life already hectic. So now I'm trying to live my life after doing 6 years from robbing and all that I'm wearing a sex charge for some I ain't do. That's enough to make me want to kill a whole bunch of How you like living with some you ain't do?
He's angry right out of the gate, and he's really taking the role of the victim. He's been falsely accused of this sex crime. You know, wouldn't that make you angry? Well, you get a flair for his criminal versatility, his impulsivity, his failure to accept responsibility, kind of blaming his girlfriend's parents, her mother, for having caused him to murder her.
Now I'm gonna get all the guns and now I'm gonna kill everything. Why? Because ain't nobody trying to hear me. But they hear me now when I start killing them. They hear me now. It's crazy.
The issues between you and your girl, that was more of her family getting involved?
It was good. Her family kept trying to get involved in our relationship, man. But they would never check on her. I don't even come in and check on her. She laid in there dead. You wanna figure out what's going on? You texting me. I'm the one who killed her because you didn't give a about her. If you did, if you would have checked on your loved one, her body was laying there, y'all ain't seen until I let that on fire.
He sort of distanced himself from his own responsibility. He's just figured out how to deal with that by just sort of like admitting it and then just sweeping it to the side. And there's certainly grandiose things about Mr. Beal, but this one is definitely a twisted one. Like the idea that he's the better person because he actually cared about her in some fashion, but then her family didn't because it took him setting her on fire to get their attention. his resorting to violence and the direction of that violence is kind of everybody else's fault.
Who set the fire to the car?
I did all that by myself, bro. I could have did more, but I just was like, I'm just gonna keep moving. I'm just gonna enjoy my last days. You know what I mean? I was like, I was mad. I was real mad.
According to Beal, he hasn't been heard much of his life. And so the fire is symbolic of Beal's life, in some ways going up in flames, and he acknowledges that, life is over. It's also, I think, a manifestation of his desire to be on the front stage in the most grandiose display of crime and violence. Not only am I going to kill people, but I'm also going to set a fire so everybody can see what's happening. This is the perfect opportunity for him to, be heard.
Where was she shot at?
I shot everybody in the head.
What was the deal with the tape on her and the gag?
I didn't rape her. I just tied her up. I was gonna let her go. I just wanted to shut the up. But she was already in this mode. I was like, look, man, I ain't trying to hear it, man. Put the gun to her head. I told her, I said, look, man, I'm gonna show you something. So I pulled the dog in the room. I poured chlorine all over that. I poured bleach all over that. I took the lighter out and tried to set it on fire. She hops off the bed. And this is what she tells me. He has nothing to do with this. Take me, let him live.
He was hunting the dog?
Yeah. She said, take me, take my life instead. Let the dog live. He had nothing to do with this. I said, word? I told you I would let you go and live your life. And I was just gonna be on the run. So at this point, she not listening. She like, no. I'm like, shut the up. I told you don't make no scene. Cause I was gonna leave her just like that, but not do nothing to her and let her get out.
It's still all about him. He's astonished that she would say, oh, take me, save the dog. And his whole point is, she's not even listening to him. It's not about the dog, it's not about her. He doesn't want to hear anything that she has to say. Putting the tape over her mouth, really quickly, he says, oh, no, I didn't rape her. But I think he was tired of hearing what she had to say. So she was making too much noise. And I think that lack of understanding is because he does not experience empathy like normal people do.
What did you do with Prince?
I didn't do nothing with Prince. Prince stayed alive until I came back and set the house on fire.
So you just in the crate?
Yeah. I actually stood there, so I poured gasoline all over the house. And when I tried to light it, the flames burst like they came up. They came up in front of my face, and I turned around and I seen the dog. The dog was getting burnt alive, so I was like, okay. I watched that because I was funny.
There's just absolutely no regard for a living entity, whether it's humans or animals. When you look at Beal's behavior, there really is an element of sadism to them, not only in the way he interacts and describes the way that he murdered his girlfriend and the conversation they had leading up to her death, and then also to hurt a completely innocent, vulnerable animal is sadistic.
I was gonna let her live, but when you tell me leave the dog and take you, you don't really give a about us nowhere. You ain't give a about your life nowhere. So she made it seem, so that's what I brought her in.
When was Clifton shot? I know you did care about him. I did know that.
Yeah, I did.
I know growing up he treated you really good. I can't say what happened, like you said, when you got out.
Like every time I was asking for a little bit of help, he'd tell me he ain't got it, and I know you got it. I know you lying to me. So you keep telling me you lying, and I'm gonna take it off. So when I finally got in, you know what I mean? When I finally got in there with my cousin, I popped his ass. Wednesday or Thursday. Me and my cousin went in there.
He's uptown?
Yeah.
What happened to Clifton?
Me and my cousin went in there, and I made sure, as soon as I walk in there, he laid down on the couch. So as soon as he see him come behind me, he like, whoa, what the boom, I shot him in the head. I ain't give This is what happens when somebody getting tired. They don't care what die.
Moving on to the father figure, Clifton Baxter, there's no longitudinal connection of any kind of relationship. That regard is absent. That building of a connection, you know, the things that enable most of us to build a relationship, those traits are missing in psychopaths. Their relationships are transactional. What can they do for me now? And that's where he focuses his explanation. Hey, in the recent time, whenever I asked for money, not only did Clifton Baxter not give it to me, he lied about it. You know, so it's like a double affront. This person is a liar who, you know, disrespects me and won't give me what I want. So I shot him.
I know you're angry. I mean, that's clear, but do you have any sort of remorse or anything looking back?
Remorse? Like what? I don't feel nothing no more. I've been stopped feeling. I probably gonna kill some more people because that's how mad I am behind all this life. I got judged on that trying to live a regular life. No, like man.
I think his theme is, I should never have been accused of a sex offense. They should have cleared me. I think he feels that this has ruined his life, and now he's going to make us all pay for it. I think he's being genuine about the idea of no remorse.
My dad had killed her too. I just caught more bodies than I just tried not to let that side come out, but all this that was going on there, it just popped out. I had enough. Like, I just had enough. Tried to be better than him. Failed at that. He got more bodies than him.
There probably was some inherent propensity towards violence. He was surrounded by violence. When Cola Beale was a child, his father, Cola Beale III, actually tried to murder his mother. She survived, but now his father is in jail for having murdered his stepmother. He's identifying as a killer as well by saying, oh, my father is a killer too. And then he talks about having a higher body count than his father. We know that with psychopathy, some of the research has shown there is a genetic component to it. Not that that's the only reason that somebody may have psychopathic traits, but given his father's history, it does make me wonder about what might be underlying from a biological perspective. So the whole nature and nurture, both of those factors seem to play a role for Beale.
So that brings me into your cousin, which is McLean. His last name's McLean. Now, he went with you on that Wednesday.
Yeah.
So then what happened between you and your cousin?
I didn't want to do it, but I did it because he's snapping on everybody that's around us. My life gone. You talking stuff and like yelling. So I tell you to calm down because I already killed 2 people. I'm already seeing red. He started making a scene, I told him to calm down. And he tried to put his hands on me. I got fed up with him because he kept talking like you not about this, you not gonna do nothing. Like, bro, I just killed 2 people. You don't think I'm ready to shoot again? So I went right in the kitchen and shot him right in the head. He didn't drop, he just kept moving in circles. Then I shot him in the back to make sure he hit the ground.
Do you feel any remorse for killing 3?
I don't feel no remorse about none of this at all. When you snap, you don't think about remorse. That's not something that comes to your mind when you're snapping.
Obviously, the police were looking for you. So were you planning on running away or looking for more people?
I was definitely looking for more people. But I was choosing my people wisely. I wasn't choosing just regular people.
These are examples of an individual who doesn't have that human connection that the average person does. And he doesn't seem to feel guilty at all. In fact, isn't even sure what he should feel guilty about. You know, her family interfered. Mr. Baxter didn't give him money when he needed. You know, his cousin was talking back and wouldn't stop. He really has this very shallow affect, and that he doesn't seem emotionally impacted at all. For all 3 of Beal's victims, he has made a personal connection and justification for why he should murder them. They all deserved it for one reason or another.
Cola, a lot of people in your position would say, I didn't do this, and plead not guilty.
As a man, I will take up for my wrongdoings. I snapped on my cousin for a simple reason. I snapped on my dad for a reason. And I snapped on my girlfriend for a different reason. None of this had nothing to do with what they liked and what they were dealing with.
Did you harm anybody else in the process that no one has found out about yet?
No, but I was getting ready to pop back out in the daylight, and I definitely was about to do something. If they hadn't picked me up, last night, I definitely would have got out and let out some more steam, because at the end of the day, nobody hears you when you talking regular. You gotta do something like this. I done lived my life. I was gonna do it differently, but it went out like that, so it's over with.
Cola Beal is a wonderful example, when we think of psychopathy, of someone whose predominant traits are those of callousness, selfishness, and the anger component. When they feel like they're not getting what they want or they've been wronged, they're gonna make everybody pay. They really attribute to other people the causes for why they do what they do. They don't blame themselves. All they can do is react.
He confessed to our cameras yesterday to committing 3 murders in the span of just 3 days.
Beal told me he was prepared to take any penalty coming to him from a judge and from a jury.
Polk County Sheriff's Office.
Yes, I'd like to report my dad and my daughter missing. They sent me a text saying they were going to Georgia, and they ain't there. All their clothes are missing, pillows, camping equipment. I don't even know if they really left Florida. Talked to my dad about maybe seeing if he could take over and watch her for me, because she doesn't want to, she has oppositional defiancy. The 23rd was last day that we heard from them.
Okay, so you need to see the officer. They're saying they have to make contact with you.
Thank you. Bye.
When the police arrive, Cheyenne Jessie's not crying, she doesn't sound worried. Her daughter is a 6-year-old who has medical needs, has behavioral problems, appointments with doctors, and it seems really unusual that a mother would wait a week to call 911. This is a context in which I think the police should be thinking, this woman knows a great deal more than she's letting on.
How's Meredith and Shane's relationship as, mother-daughter? How was she as a kid?
She could really be held on will sometimes. She had her good days where she was a perfect angel, and then she sometimes just like flipping a switch. She could be completely miserable. We took her to Peace River and everything. They got her diagnosed with also defiancy, bipolar, and ADHD.
Did that ever put a strain on yours and Shane's relationship?
Yeah. And
Okay, if you don't mind me asking.
At one point I told her if we don't get some kind of help for the kid, I ain't gonna be able to put up with it.
We would expect a loving mother to say, okay, well then you must leave because my first obligation is to my child. But instead, Jessie sees her daughter as an object that gets in her way. She doesn't find any use in her. She's blocking her from what she wants.
How was her and Mark?
Everybody has their little disagreements. They had their share. He's yelled at her to get her to understand stuff sometimes. He had to do that. Because if you yell at Cheyenne, she shuts down. Somewhat. She doesn't really want to talk.
As we learn more about Jessie, we find out that she has a complicated relationship with her father. There's confrontation, there's anger, irritability, according to her boyfriend. This complicates the features for someone with psychopathy because since they don't regulate emotions like a healthy person does, it makes them more frustrated and they can't just get what they want. So they tend to become quite impatient and short with people. They ask for something and when they don't get it, they get angry and they react.
While Meredith has been gone, have you attempted to call
Mark? I attempted to call him. I texted him and he sent me the text messages that he ain't coming back and go ahead and get rid of all his stuff. I'm taking Meredith up to her grandmother's in Georgia. So when she got home, I let her read the text message.
What did she do or how did she act?
She broke down. She cried. I said, well, the best thing to do right now is see if we can get in touch with you.
Okay, so the morning after you get these text messages, you and her go to Mark's house?
Yeah.
When you were over there, did you smell anything?
Yeah, a real horrible smell. Then she pulled a coon out from underneath the house and threw it out into the woods. She said she found dead rats in the house too. But she also asked me something funny at Walmart.
What's that?
How long does it take maggots to decay a body? And she asked me if I thought one of those big 55-gallon tubs would hold the body.
I think Jessie thought that she had control over Cody. I think she thought that she could, use her feminine ways and victim mentality, and in turn, she was buying his loyalty, but that's not what happened. He comes out and tells police everything. One of the traits of psychopathy is trying to control other people and control the story that's being told about you to others. And the way she did that, or attempted to do that with Cody, sort of backfired.
Is there anything else you want to tell us? Can I think about something else? This is right now, bro, at the time.
I had nothing to do with that.
But I'm gonna start from the beginning. Can you freely? You wanted to help?
Yeah, I wanted to help. My daughter we found.
So did you talk to him again? Did you try to call him? Did you ever talk to him on Sunday?
No.
Okay, did you talk to him on Monday?
No, I didn't try myself. I drove by there and they weren't home.
When you went in the front door, was there anything out of place or anything?
It just stunk in there. It just smelled like dead rats or dead something. Well, I did find some rats and stuff, and I threw them away. I searched the house. There was nothing in there. I found a coon underneath the house. I took it out and threw it.
What do you think happened to your dad and your daughter?
His girlfriend texted me and said that he rented a car Monday. I'm afraid that, like, maybe he didn't leave Florida and he went over to Vicky's house and she did something. That's what I'm feeling. I think she might have hurt them or something, or maybe she has them in her house.
I know you have a very tough life, okay? Having to deal with your daughter and those situations. And do you love your daughter?
I love with all my heart.
All right. But I know you're having a tough time with that, and it's affecting your relationship because you said that even with your daughter not there, it's made it better for you and Cody to work on your problems.
So we can handle her.
There's an idea in the concept of psychopathy that we talk about, which is called shallow affect, which refers to the idea that people don't have a wide range of emotions. We just get this monotonous kind of tone describing things, but putting out some ideas that in and of themselves are actually quite distressing. Maybe she's been hurt by girlfriend Vicky, right? She's trying out different narratives about what might have happened that will help shift the blame from her. I think that's a manipulative strategy that to keep the police guessing, keep the police busy, but not paying attention to her.
I'm telling you right now, I just need you to be honest with me. I don't think you found a dead wreck, okay? I really don't think that. There's blood at the house, and you know the blood's in it. You knew the blood was there when you were at the house. You knew it before the police got there.
No, I didn't.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Where are they?
I don't know. All I know is that when I take my medicine, I pass out, and I don't remember what happened during the time that I'm...
You passed out. I don't believe that. Okay? This little show is not working.
Not a show.
You're not crying. There's not one tear. Your daughter, she doesn't have a medication, and not one tear is falling from her face. So don't try to make them come out now.
I am crying. I just can't. I'm dehydrated.
I'm dehydrated. That's biologically ridiculous, right? This is someone who doesn't respond well when things get overwhelming, who does not like to be challenged, who does not like when things get rough, when things don't happen the way she just wants them to happen, and will respond negatively, will respond in a way in which other people were not anticipating. She's definitely saying the first thing that comes to mind to try to make it more reasonable. But the problem is that her reasonableness is so ridiculous that it's unbelievable.
Here's your question. Why did you ask Cody at Walmart if he thinks the body would fit in a 55-gallon drum? Why did you ask him? Did Cody give you an ultimatum? Did he say you need to tighten up with your daughter or else? Did he tell you that?
Yeah.
I know it's hard. I know it's going to be real tough to tell that truth. I know you want to. I think you're a bad person.
I always had to defend myself from my daddy, so I told him, take care of my daughter because I can't take care of her no more.
You had to defend yourself from your dad?
My dad's always gotten angry at me and yelled and like gets in my face and punches the wall and stuff. And I've always had the coward in the corner.
So was he abusive when you dropped Meredith off? Or just verbal?
Yeah, he verbally and he said that you're a horrible mom for just dropping your kid off and leaving. Like your mother, you're just like your mother. You drop your kid off and you leave her. And I'm like, now I ask you to take her for me. I feel so worthless with my dad around.
Now she's a victim, someone who's afraid of Mark Weekly and terrified and vulnerable. So this is setting the stage for a new narrative. If there's a physical threat, we generally accept the idea that a person has the right to physically defend themselves. So she's planting the seeds that it wasn't just verbal, it was physical. Harm is being done to her by this aggressive, violent man, her father.
What happened?
Oh, I don't remember. Like, it's like they became a different person. Like, I blacked out.
And what happened when you blacked out? You eventually woke up because you cleaned up. So what happened? And it may have been because you're mad, your dad came at you and stuff went wrong.
When someone says they black out, especially in a criminal case, it's usually a convenient excuse to discard any sort of responsibility. Jesse's placing blame on her medication and why she takes medication. She's not just controlling the situation of how police are seeing her, but she's displacing blame, which is a key psychopathic trait. They don't take any responsibility for what they've done. Taking responsibility is not in their mentality whatsoever.
So what happened when you got there? Did he come at you with a knife?
He came at me like this.
With a knife?
This way, and then my daughter was coming this way, and that's all I remember is you pushing her away.
And then what did you do?
I kicked him in his balls, and then he kept talking more, and I wanted up on the floor. And then I stabbed him in the chest.
At what room did this happen at? You grabbed your gun?
Yeah.
After you stabbed him?
Yeah, but he was still alive. He said, I'm gonna kill you too. I pushed it down and fired it on his neck.
You shot his neck?
Yeah.
Okay. And then, did you see blood on your daughter?
I don't remember that. I don't remember that at all. All I remember is that I had blood on me. And I was scared.
Did you stab your daughter?
No.
Who stabbed your daughter?
This is where you see the remarkable ability to invent a story very quickly. The minute he says, did he come at you with a knife? She's like, yes. She's already playing the acting. She's making it up as she goes. It is a remarkable example of how rapidly a psychopath can generate what might be a compelling narrative to someone who's like falls for the tears and then the apparent detail in what she's saying. This is the new scenario. This is the new reality she wants to create.
At what point did you give first aid to your daughter?
I went over there, and then when I grabbed her neck popped backwards. It was horrifying. There was blood coming out of everywhere.
Well, where was the injury at? Can you point it on my neck?
It was straight through all the way back through a drug dealer. I kind of covered it, and I'm like, Meredith, and I felt the light go out of her, and I'm like, no, Meredith, please.
One question I have is, there's in the couch and bus seat, there's like slash marks there and puncture holes. How'd that happen?
I just cut it to make it look like dog was on there. I don't know, I didn't want to look at the couch anymore, so after they were gone, at the house, I started stabbing the couches because I was pissed off.
I would have anticipated her to be crying. And it isn't. It's not the time that she's crying. It's cold. It's meant for other people to see her as a grieving mother. But she's not a grieving mother. She didn't care that her daughter died. Then later she says, I was angry. She was just so angry. She had been angry. She had been angry at Monroe for threatening to leave. She had been angry at her father for the abuses that she thought that she suffered from before. And she was most angry at her daughter because the daughter put her in a position to have to make a choice. And the psychopath doesn't like to be forced choice.
And what's up with the shovel that you took out of the bathtub?
I was trying to clean up the blood. To shovel up the crap that they left there.
What crap?
When the body dies, it releases the feces and rigor mortis and stuff. I think that I didn't know what to do. And it's just something I seen on Criminal Minds.
So he attacked you with a knife, but he never cut you? I don't see any cuts. So if this was all done out of self-defense, why didn't you tell anybody? Why didn't you call the sheriff's office and let us know what happened?
You sure? I don't believe that story. I think you stabbed your daughter because you wanted to get rid of her to save your relationship.
No, I didn't.
And you also killed your dad on purpose. There was no self-defense there. Well, they were scared, but we need to find them. Are they under the house?
No, they were in the shed. I didn't know what to do.
Are they in totes or what?
I just don't want to tell.
What stands out here is that Jesse has no remorse, no shame, no feelings whatsoever that her daughter is dead, her dad is dead, and that she did this. And that's pretty consistent with a psychopath. So if she is crying or pretending to cry, I think it has more to do with her going to jail and being punished and losing the one thing that probably mattered the most to her, which was the affection and attention of Matthew Cody Monroe.
According to reports, Cheyenne Jessie killed her father and daughter inside her father's home. She returned days later and put their bodies in plastic totes, then hid them in a neighbor's shed.
Cheyenne Jessie, I think, is a product of a lot of different things. Her own psychopathy was probably a development of a deprived childhood. I think she ran up against a society in which she thought that the only thing that she had was her being a woman, and her being a woman meant that she needed to have a man. And the challenge that she received by having a 6-year-old who was acting like a 6-year-old, I think all of that was too overwhelming for her. And in her psychopathy, she was willing to completely detach from the relationships that she should have leaned on for support. I also think that those relationships, whether it was her father or whether it was her boyfriend or whether it was her daughter, were never really gonna be healthy. And Cheyenne just responded in the only way that she knew how, and that's to be violent towards them.
Jessie, who is accused of killing her father and her own daughter, has been found guilty on both counts. The jury did recommend Jessie be put to death for killing her daughter, but life in prison for murdering her father. The judge is scheduled to sentence Jessie on Friday.
What did you use to cut it up?
When the skill saw wasn't working, that's when I took a break and was going to get a rotary saw.
I've been driving around just looking for target of opportunity. I was a sick man.
Everybody that met me would tell you they thought that I was a killer.
I came back and set the house on fire. So I was like, okay, I watched that because I was plenty.
Not one tear.
I am crying. I just can't. I'm dehydrated.
I was thinking about slicing people up and cutting them open, dissecting them essentially.
And I made sure that's dead because no dead man tells no tale.
At 2:17 a.m., the phone rang inside a concrete apartment block in eastern Berlin, the sound slicing through the night like a blade dragged across glass. And by the time the receiver was lifted, the city had already begun to change, because somewhere between the final echo of that ring and the first police siren tearing down the empty streets, a crime slipped out of its own moment in time and started a journey that would last decades, a cold case before anyone dared to call it one, a story that refused to stay buried even as the wall had already fallen and the city tried desperately to reinvent itself. Brick by brick, lie by lie. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, a narrow hallway smelling of dust, old paint, and boiled cabbage. A place where footsteps echoed too loudly and neighbors pretended not to hear anything after midnight. A place where doors stayed closed and curtains stayed drawn. Because in 1991 Berlin, privacy was still a reflex left over from surveillance, and trust was a luxury nobody could afford. Inside, the lights were off. The television was still on. Static hissed across the screen like a whisper that never learned how to stop. And on the living room floor, half-shadowed by a flickering street lamp outside, lay the body that would become a question mark stretched across 30 years. No signs of forced entry, No overturned furniture. No broken glass. Just silence, thick and intentional, the kind that feels arranged. The victim had been careful. Or the killer had been calm. Maybe both. A single wound, precise, efficient, not the work of panic but of purpose, and already the first officers on the scene felt it. That cold sensation crawling up the spine, the unmistakable awareness that this was not going to be simple, not going to be solved by sunrise, not going to fit neatly into a report marked closed. Outside, blue lights washed over peeling walls covered in old graffiti, slogans from a dead regime fading beneath new ones hastily sprayed in the chaos after reunification, and neighbors gathered in clusters that pretended to be curious but were really afraid, because everyone in that building understood the same thing at the same time. If someone could die like this, quietly, cleanly, then anyone could. Names began to circulate, whispered more than spoken, and already the shock was spreading. A small tremor moving outward through the block, the street, the district, the city. The victim was not famous, not powerful, not someone whose face had ever appeared on television. That, perhaps, was the most unsettling part. A life ordinary enough to disappear into the cracks of history, and yet strange enough, once examined closely, to leave investigators staring at files long after midnight, wondering what they had missed. Friends described someone reserved. Colleagues said dependable. Neighbors said almost nothing at all. A person who blended in, who understood the value of being unremarkable in a city that had spent decades punishing the wrong kind of attention. Detectives moved through the apartment slowly, methodically, cameras clicking, gloves snapping on, eyes scanning for disruption in the order of things, and they found almost none. A cup in the sink, a coat on the chair, shoes neatly placed by the door. It was the kind of scene that made seasoned officers uneasy, because it suggested control, and control meant planning, and planning meant a mind that would not be easily traced. Then, in the kitchen, something small, almost laughable in its simplicity, caught the light. A fingerprint, not smeared, not partial, not distorted by blood or sweat or haste. A clean impression on the smooth surface of a glass, left behind as if deliberately, confidently, like a signature that dared someone to notice. It was photographed, dusted, catalogued, sealed into evidence, and then, like so many things in 1991 Berlin, it slipped into a system unprepared for what was coming next. Because the city was drowning in transition. Files were being moved, departments restructured, databases merged or abandoned altogether, and in the chaos of rebuilding a nation, details fell through the cracks. Evidence rooms filled faster than they could be organized. Old protocols clashed with new technologies. And somewhere in that administrative fog, the fingerprint waited, silent, patient, meaningless without a match. The investigation pushed forward anyway. Interviews, alibis, leads that went nowhere. Someone mentioned a strange phone call weeks earlier. Someone else remembered an argument in the stairwell, voices raised, words lost to memory. A coworker recalled a meeting that ended abruptly, tension thick enough to taste. Each clue promised movement, and each one dissolved under scrutiny, leaving behind the same question in different shapes. Who would do this, and why leave so little behind? Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The headlines faded. Another crime replaced this one. Another shock, another siren, another name. And just like that, the case cooled. Not officially abandoned, never forgotten entirely, but relegated to a shelf where unresolved things go to wait, gathering dust, aging in silence. A cold case, though nobody used the term yet because to call it cold felt like admitting defeat. Years passed. Berlin transformed itself in concrete and glass. New buildings rose where old scars had been scraped away. Tourists walked paths once patrolled by guards with rifles. The city learned how to sell its own history back to the world, cleaned up and captioned. But in police archives, the file remained unchanged, a snapshot of a moment frozen in outdated forms and yellowing paper. The fingerprint still locked away, unassuming, unimpressive, a single ridge pattern among millions. Detectives retired. Witnesses moved. Memories blurred. Some died. Others forgot. And the case settled into legend, mentioned occasionally in hushed tones, A reminder that not everything had been solved. Not everything could be wrapped up with a press conference and a tidy explanation. It became the kind of story told late at night after too much coffee, when someone inevitably asked if there were any cases that still bothered you, cases that followed you home. Then technology caught up. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Slowly, quietly, the way real change happens. Databases expanded. Algorithms improved. Old evidence was digitized, re-examined, fed into systems that could see patterns humans never could. And one day, long after the victim's name had faded from public memory, a technician opened a drawer, pulled out a thin envelope, and held up a piece of the past that no longer belonged where it was. The fingerprint was scanned again, this time into a world that did not exist in 1991, a world where millions of records spoke to each other in fractions of a second, where borders meant less, where time itself seemed compressible. And when the system processed the image, something happened that no one in that evidence room had expected, something that made the technician stop breathing for just a moment longer than usual. Not a complete story, not a confession, just a name attached to a pattern of lines, a digital echo responding to a question asked decades too late. The system didn't care about context or consequences. It simply did what it was designed to do. And in that instant, the past surged forward, crashing into the present with enough force to rewrite everything that had been assumed. Because the name that appeared was not supposed to be there. It belonged to someone who had never been a suspect. Someone who had been interviewed and dismissed. Someone whose presence at the edges of the case had been noted and forgotten. A person who had moved through the original investigation like a ghost, seen but never touched, ordinary enough to escape suspicion, connected enough to be remembered only vaguely. And suddenly, the quiet fingerprint from a glass in a small Berlin kitchen was no longer just evidence. It was an accusation. Phones rang again, just like they had at 2:17 a.m. decades earlier. Only now the city was different, the voices older, the stakes heavier. Files were reopened. Old notes reread. Every decision from the original investigation was dragged back into the light, scrutinized, questioned, second-guessed. How had this been missed? Why had no one pushed harder? What else had been overlooked? The cold case wasn't just waking up. It was demanding answers. And as detectives began retracing steps through a city that barely resembled its former self, one unsettling truth became impossible to ignore. If a single fingerprint could survive 30 years in silence, waiting for the right moment to speak, then what else had been patiently hiding in the dark, reshaping history without anyone noticing, until now? The name sat on the screen longer than it should have, glowing with the quiet confidence of a machine that does not doubt itself, and for several seconds no one in the room spoke, because everyone understood the weight of what they were looking at, the way a single line of text could pull an entire case out of the past and drag it screaming into the present. The match was not perfect in the way movies like to promise, not a cinematic certainty, but it was strong enough, statistically undeniable, a probability that edged so close to truth it made excuses feel childish. A fingerprint lifted from a glass in 1991 Berlin now pointed to a living person, still breathing, still walking the same streets, still carrying a history that had never been fully examined. The first instinct was disbelief. Someone said there must be an error, a contamination, a mislabeled envelope from an era when records were handwritten and transitions were sloppy. Someone else pulled the old file, fingers brushing over brittle paper, and read the name again, this time printed in faded ink, buried in a paragraph marked, "No further action." It was there all along, a footnote masquerading as closure. Interviewed once. Cooperative. No motive established. Cleared by circumstance rather than certainty. Back in 1991, the person had been unremarkable in the way that protected so many from deeper scrutiny. A routine life. A job that paid the bills. A presence that never lingered long enough in any one place to raise alarms. When detectives spoke to them, they answered politely, carefully, the way people do when they believe the truth is on their side, or when they know exactly how much of it to share. There had been an alibi, thin but unchallenged, anchored in a memory nobody bothered to verify with urgency, because the city was busy and the list of suspects was long. Now, decades later, that same name was circled in red on a whiteboard, surrounded by question marks, arrows, fragments of a story that had never quite made sense. Investigators began reconstructing the life that had once been skimmed over, looking for pressure points, patterns, anything that explained why this person's fingerprint had been left behind on the night everything stopped. They started with proximity. How close had they really been to the victim? The original file said acquaintance, a word that hid more than it revealed. Digging deeper uncovered overlapping routines, shared spaces, moments where paths crossed often enough to form familiarity. Same cafe, same late train, same stretch of street walked at the same hour week after week. Not friendship, not intimacy, but a quiet orbit that allowed two lives to brush against each other without leaving obvious marks. Then there were the conversations. Not documented, not recorded, only remembered now by people who were older, less certain, but still capable of recalling tone if not content. A neighbor remembered seeing them talk once in the stairwell, bodies angled close, voices low. A former coworker recalled a name mentioned offhand, a complaint dismissed as trivial at the time. Nothing explosive, nothing that screamed motive, just friction, subtle and persistent, the kind that accumulates unnoticed until it finds an outlet. As detectives followed the trail forward in time, they discovered something else, something that had not been visible from the vantage point of 1991. A pattern of disappearance. Not crimes, not arrests, not anything dramatic enough to make headlines, but a habit of leaving just before consequences arrived. Jobs ended abruptly, apartments vacated with minimal notice, relationships dissolved without explanation. Each move reasonable on its own, but together they formed a rhythm, a life spent perpetually one step ahead of scrutiny. The fingerprint became the gravitational center around which everything else began to turn. How had it gotten there? The original scene suggested calm, a visitor who had time to drink, to stand in the kitchen long enough to leave a clean impression. That contradicted the story given decades earlier, a brief stop, a casual visit days before the murder. If that were true, why had no other traces been found? Why that glass and not the door, not the table, not anywhere else a guest might touch? Modern forensic analysts weighed in, offering interpretations unavailable to the original investigators. The pressure of the print suggested a relaxed grip. The placement implied the glass had been held, not moved. This was not someone passing through. This was someone present. As the implications settled in, the case began to ripple outward, disturbing more than just the neat assumptions of the old file. Families were notified. Old witnesses were contacted, some startled to hear voices from a past they had buried, others wary. Their first reaction a defensive tightening that suggested they knew more than they had ever shared. Each phone call reopened wounds, stirred guilt, resurrected doubts that had been silenced by time. The person at the center of it all was approached carefully. No handcuffs. No dramatic confrontation. Just a request to talk, framed as routine, though everyone involved understood it was anything but. They agreed calmly, even eagerly, a reaction that unsettled the detectives more than refusal would have. In the interview room, under lights far brighter than those used decades earlier, they looked older, worn down by years that had left their mark in subtle ways, but their composure remained intact. They acknowledged knowing the victim, a surprise to no one. They repeated the same account given in 1991, almost word for word, a detail that was either evidence of honesty or proof of rehearsal. They denied being there that night, denied touching the glass. When confronted with the fingerprint, they paused, just long enough to be noticed, then shrugged it off as a mistake, a visit misremembered, science overestimating its own precision. But science had changed, and memory, as detectives knew too well, was the least reliable witness of all. Records were pulled, travel histories reconstructed, old transit data long thought irrelevant was re-examined. A train ticket surfaced, time-stamped within the window everyone had agreed was impossible. Phone logs showed a gap, an absence of activity that lined up too neatly with the timeline of the crime. Each discovery chipped away at the comfortable narrative that had protected the suspect for so long. Still, there was no confession, no breakdown, just a steady insistence on innocence, delivered with the confidence of someone who had already outlived the consequences once and believed they could do it again. The law, after all, had limits. Evidence degraded, witnesses faded, and the passage of time was a shield as much as it was a burden. Inside the investigative team, tension grew. Some believed the fingerprint was enough to justify pushing forward, to finally bring closure to a case that had haunted the department for generations. Others worried about the risks, about building a case on evidence collected under outdated standards, about the possibility of reopening a wound only to watch it collapse under legal scrutiny. Meanwhile, the story leaked. Not all at once, not officially, just enough to ignite curiosity. A journalist caught wind of a reopened Berlin cold case, a single fingerprint at the heart of it, and soon the headlines began to reappear, updated for a new era, carrying the same sense of shock that had briefly gripped the city decades earlier. Old neighbors recognized the address. Younger readers discovered the story for the first time, absorbing it without the context of a divided city, seeing it instead as a puzzle finally daring to be solved. The suspect's name circulated quietly at first, protected by legal caution, but in certain circles it was already known, already discussed in tones that mixed disbelief with grim satisfaction. People began to ask themselves how many times they had crossed paths with someone capable of such silence. How many ordinary faces hid extraordinary secrets. For the detectives, the case stopped being about a single night in 1991 and became something larger, something heavier. It was about the cost of delay, about what happens when a city moves on faster than its unanswered questions, about the uncomfortable realization that justice does not expire just because attention does. Late one evening, alone with the file spread across a desk, a veteran investigator traced a finger over the photocopy of that fingerprint. Now enlarged, clarified, undeniable. It looked almost elegant, a looping pattern of ridges and valleys, beautiful in a way that felt wrong. This, they thought, had waited. This had endured regime change, technological revolutions, human forgetfulness. This had outlived lies. And if it had survived this long, it wasn't finished yet. Because somewhere in the spaces between what had been proven and what was still denied, there was a truth that refused to settle, a truth that promised to surface whether anyone was ready or not, dragging with it the full weight of a past Berlin had never fully escaped. The problem with reopening the past is that it does not stay where you put it, and as investigators pushed deeper into the life now tethered to that single fingerprint, they discovered that time had not erased anything. It had only rearranged it, scattering fragments across decades until the pattern was no longer obvious at first glance. What once looked like coincidence began to feel deliberate. What once seemed benign now carried weight. And every answer unearthed another question, sharper than the last. They went back to the beginning, not the night of the murder, but the months before it, reconstructing a timeline that had never been properly built. Calendar pages were filled in retroactively. Pay stubs, letters, archived employment records, all dragged into the present and laid side by side. The victim's routines emerged first, predictable to the point of vulnerability. Same routes, same hours. A life that followed grooves worn deep enough for someone else to memorize without effort. Then the suspect's movements were layered on top. At first, the overlap looked accidental, the kind of convergence any two people in a dense city might experience. But the more data was added, the more the margins narrowed. There were too many intersections clustered too tightly in time. Too many moments where one appeared shortly after the other. The cafe where the victim read every Tuesday evening. The late train home on Thursdays. The market stall visited on Sunday mornings. Familiarity without acknowledgement. Observation without engagement. Detectives began to suspect that the relationship described in 1991 had been intentionally minimized, framed as casual to avoid scrutiny. When they questioned people again, decades later, the hesitation was telling. Not outright lies but corrections, clarifications, small upgrades to memory that shifted the dynamic from distant to known. Someone admitted they had seen them arguing once, not loudly, not violently, but with an intensity that made others look away. Another recalled an unreturned gift, something personal, something unwanted. It was the kind of tension that rarely leaves a paper trail, the kind that grows quietly in the dark, fed by resentment, entitlement, or obsession, emotions that do not announce themselves until they have already done damage. The investigators focused next on the alibi, the thin shield that had deflected suspicion all those years ago. In 1991, it had rested on a single assertion. The suspect claimed to have been elsewhere, with someone who vaguely remembered the night but could not recall details. No follow-up had been done. No verification attempted. It had been enough, then, to move on. Now, it wasn't. The person who had supposedly provided that alibi was located, older, slower, surprised to be contacted after so long. Their recollection was shaky, shaped by repetition rather than certainty. They remembered being asked to confirm something, remembered agreeing, but could not remember the night itself. When pressed, they admitted something they had never said out loud before. They had trusted the suspect. They had assumed there was no reason not to. That trust, investigators realized, had been contagious. As pressure mounted, cracks began to show in the suspect's story. Subtle at first, barely perceptible shifts in phrasing. Changes that might have gone unnoticed if they were not being compared to statements preserved in writing decades earlier. Times drifted. Distances shortened. Explanations grew more elaborate, as if simplicity was no longer sufficient. Still, there was no moment of collapse, no cinematic unraveling. Just a steady resistance, controlled and careful, the posture of someone who believed the worst was still survivable. Behind the scenes, legal teams argued. Prosecutors demanded certainty. Defense attorneys prepared for the inevitability of public scrutiny. The fingerprint, powerful as it was, could not speak on its own. It needed context, corroboration, motive. It needed a story that could withstand not just investigation but doubt. That was when another detail resurfaced, something dismissed early on as irrelevant. A call. In the original file, it was a footnote, barely worth mentioning. A phone call placed from a public booth near the victim's building shortly before the estimated time of death. No recording, no content, just a timestamp and a location. In 1991, tracing it had been impossible. Now it was an invitation. Telecommunications records from that era were incomplete but not non-existent. Technicians dug through archives, searching for patterns, anomalies, anything that narrowed the field. They found that the booth had been used infrequently that night, unusual for the area. One call stood out, not for its destination, which remained unknown, but for its duration. Long enough to matter, long enough to suggest intent. When the suspect was asked about phone booths, their response was immediate and dismissive, too quick, too practiced. They hadn't used one in years, they said. They preferred privacy. They preferred certainty. But records showed something else. A pattern of avoiding traceable communication during critical moments, a habit invisible until technology evolved enough to reveal it. The investigation began to feel less like a search and more like a narrowing corridor. Journalists sensed it too. The tone of coverage shifted from curiosity to expectation. The phrase Berlin cold case appeared more frequently, paired with words like breakthrough and long awaited. The community, once distant, leaned in, hungry for resolution, for reassurance that time had not won. But resolution is a dangerous promise. Inside the department, younger officers struggled with the emotional weight of a case older than their careers, while veterans wrestled with guilt, wondering if they had been part of the system that let this slip away. Meetings stretched late into the night, fueled by coffee and the quiet desperation of people who knew they might only get one chance to do this right. And then there was the suspect, still free, still living a life that had continued uninterrupted for 30 years. Friends defended them. Family insisted on innocence. The idea that someone could carry such a secret for so long felt unbearable, almost offensive, to those who believed they knew them. Denial took root deep and stubborn. The detectives returned to the apartment building, now renovated, modernized, its history smoothed over by fresh paint and new tenants who knew nothing of what had happened there. Standing in the kitchen where the fingerprint had been left, they tried to imagine the moment itself. The sound of glass touching a counter, the weight of a decision being made, the silence that followed. It was there, in that reconstructed space, that one investigator noticed something the original photos had captured but no one had emphasized. The glass was not part of a set. It was different from the others in the cupboard, heavier, newer. Not something a host would normally offer. More like something brought from elsewhere, something familiar. When confronted with this detail, the suspect hesitated again, just briefly, before offering an explanation that raised more questions than it answered. A gift, they said. Something exchanged casually. But no one else remembered it. No receipt. No matching item. Another story built on air. As weeks turned into months, the pressure became unbearable. Every interview felt like a standoff. Every document felt like a countdown. The fingerprint remained the anchor, the one thing that refused reinterpretation, its ridges unchanging, indifferent to denial. Yet for all the momentum, the case still hovered in a precarious space between revelation and collapse. Without a confession, without a witness willing to place the suspect definitively at the scene at the exact moment, everything depended on whether the past could be made to speak clearly enough for the present to listen. Late one night, as rain streaked down the windows of the station, an analyst reviewing old materials noticed something that had been scanned but never fully translated. A handwritten note, scribbled hastily in the margin of an early report, almost illegible. It mentioned a sound. Not a scream, not a struggle, just a word. Footsteps. Leaving, not arriving. No one had followed up on it. The analyst circled the note, heart pounding, and realized that the case might not hinge on what happened inside the apartment at all, but on what happened immediately after, in the seconds when someone believed they had already won. And in that realization lay the unsettling possibility that the most damning evidence was not locked away in a drawer, not encoded in a fingerprint, but still out there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to ask the right question at the wrong time. Footsteps. The word lingered longer than it should have. A single scratch of ink in the margin of an old report suddenly louder than all the carefully catalogued evidence combined. Because footsteps meant movement, and movement meant witnesses, and witnesses meant memory, even if that memory had been ignored, dismissed, or never fully understood. The note had been written by a junior officer on scene that night, someone whose name barely registered in the hierarchy, someone who had moved on long ago, but whose instinct, captured in that one word, had survived the purge of relevance. Investigators began again, this time not inside the apartment, but outside it, stepping into the hallway, the stairwell, the threshold spaces where crimes rarely feel dramatic enough to be important. In 1991, the building had been dim, poorly lit, the kind of place where sounds traveled farther than faces, where silhouettes mattered more than details. Doors were thin. Walls remembered vibrations. People heard more than they saw. They tracked down residents who had lived there at the time. A shrinking list, scattered now across suburbs and cities, some surprised to learn that what they had once overheard might finally matter. The questions were careful, specific, designed to bypass narrative and trigger sensation instead. Not what did you see, but what did you hear? Not who was there, but when did the sound stop? One person remembered pacing footsteps on the stairs, faster than normal, uneven, as if someone had taken them two at a time and then hesitated. Another recalled a door closing, not slammed, but firm, deliberate, the sound of a decision finalized. Someone else remembered looking at the clock, annoyed at being woken, registering the time without knowing why it would matter. These were not eyewitnesses in the traditional sense. They could not identify a face, but together, their recollections formed a corridor of sound, a narrow window of minutes during which someone left the building with purpose. And when investigators compared those times to the suspect's original account, the overlap was impossible to ignore. The suspect had claimed to be nowhere near the building at that hour. Technology stepped in again, filling gaps human memory could not. Old city maintenance records showed when the stairwell light had been repaired, narrowing down which fixtures were working that night. Shadows would have fallen a certain way. Footsteps would have echoed differently on concrete than on linoleum. These details mattered now because they anchored sound to space and space to time. Then came the discovery that changed the tone of the investigation from persistent to urgent. A former resident, after days of hesitation, admitted something they had never told police. Not because they were hiding anything, but because they hadn't understood it themselves. On the night of the murder, they had heard someone pause outside their door, just for a second, as if listening, as if making sure no one was watching. Then footsteps again. Faster. Leaving. When shown a lineup of photographs years later, they could not identify the person. But when asked about height, about gait, about the way the steps sounded, they described something that matched the suspect's build uncannily well. Not proof, but alignment. The suspect was questioned again. This time, the atmosphere shifted. Gone was the casual confidence, replaced by irritation, by the subtle aggression of someone who feels cornered but refuses to show fear. They dismissed the witnesses as unreliable, the memories as contaminated by media coverage. They leaned heavily on the passage of time, on the idea that decades distort truth beyond usefulness. But the detectives pressed, not with accusations, but with silence, letting the weight of accumulated details settle in the room. They mentioned the stairwell, the light, the pause outside the door. Each point delivered calmly, almost gently. And with each one, the suspect's composure tightened, jaw muscles working, eyes narrowing, the body betraying what words would not. The interview ended without a confession, but it ended differently than the ones before. There was no smile. No reassurance. Just a warning softly delivered about lawyers and rights and overreach. The kind of warning that suggests preparation, not innocence. Behind closed doors, the investigative team debated strategy. They had motive forming, opportunity narrowing, presence increasingly difficult to deny. But the case still balanced on a blade's edge. Any misstep could collapse it entirely. They needed something definitive, something that did not rely on memory or interpretation. They returned once more to the physical evidence, reprocessing everything with methods unavailable in the early 90s. Fibers, dust, trace materials clinging to objects long assumed to be inert. And from the victim's clothing, preserved carefully but unimaginatively, they extracted something small but promising. Particles inconsistent with the apartment, consistent instead with an exterior stairwell that had been undergoing repairs at the time. Concrete dust, a specific composition, rare enough to narrow location. City records confirmed it. The building's stairwell had been partially resurfaced the week of the murder. The dust would have been everywhere, impossible to avoid, clinging to shoes, transferring with movement. The presence of those particles suggested contact not days earlier, but that night. When confronted with this new analysis, the suspect changed tactics. No longer dismissive, now conciliatory. They admitted being in the building that evening, but insisted it had been earlier, harmless, a visit forgotten because it had meant nothing. They denied staying long, denied entering the apartment, denied any violence. The shifting story was noted, logged, compared. Public interest surged. Headlines sharpened. The phrase "single fingerprint rewrites history" took hold, a neat encapsulation of a truth far messier beneath the surface. The community watched closely, divided between those who believed justice was finally catching up and those who feared a rush to judgment driven by nostalgia and pressure. For the victim's family, the reopening of the case was both a gift and a torment. Hope reopened wounds they had learned to live with. Every update carried the promise of closure and the threat of disappointment. They waited, caught between wanting answers and fearing what those answers might confirm. Late one night, as investigators cross-referenced stairwell dust samples with archived maintenance logs, a pattern emerged that no one had anticipated. The same composition appeared in another location tied to the suspect, a place they had claimed not to visit during that period. It was circumstantial, but it was cumulative, another thread tightening around a story that could no longer hold itself together. The cold case was no longer dormant. It was active, volatile, alive. And yet, for all the evidence stacking up, for all the pressure mounting, the most unsettling realization had nothing to do with guilt or innocence. It was the understanding that this crime had not been impulsive. It had been quiet, controlled, executed with an awareness of environment and routine. Whoever committed it had believed they understood the system well enough to outlast it. They had been right, until now, because the footsteps that echoed down that stairwell in 1991 were no longer fading into the background of history. They were growing louder with every passing day, reverberating through a city that had changed its face but not its memory, and with each echo came the certainty that the past was done waiting, and it was ready to be heard. The moment the suspect admitted being in the building that night, the case exhaled, not in relief but in anticipation, because that single concession shifted the entire gravity of the story, dragging it out of abstraction and anchoring it to a physical place at a specific time, something that could no longer be explained away as error or coincidence. Presence was no longer theoretical. It was now a fact, however reluctantly offered, and facts, once spoken, have a way of demanding company. Investigators moved quickly, aware that momentum was fragile. They rebuilt the night minute by minute, overlaying sound, movement, and material evidence into a sequence that felt increasingly claustrophobic. The stairwell, the repaired concrete, the pause outside a door, the glass in the kitchen. Each element no longer stood alone. Together, they formed a narrow corridor through which the truth had to pass. The suspect's revised account was precise in all the wrong places. They remembered arriving earlier than the estimated time of death, remembered standing in the hallway, remembered leaving without incident. The detail was impressive, almost admirable, until it was compared against the randomness of genuine memory. Real recollections fray at the edges. This one had been sharpened. When asked why they hadn't mentioned this visit before, they blamed fear, confusion, the chaos of that era. They said Berlin in 1991 was a place where being noticed could ruin your life, where a wrong assumption could follow you forever. It was a compelling argument, rooted in shared history, and for a moment, even the detectives felt its pull. But the evidence didn't care about context. The forensic team pushed further into trace analysis, extracting meaning from fragments most people would never see. Dust became narrative. Fibers became witnesses. On the suspect's old coat, preserved by chance rather than intention, they found traces consistent with the victim's apartment, materials unique to that space, transferred through proximity and contact. Not conclusive alone, devastating in combination. The timeline tightened again. The phone booth call resurfaced, no longer a curiosity but a pivot point. Investigators mapped the distance from the booth to the apartment, calculated walking speed, factored in the reported footsteps. It fit too well. A call placed, a walk taken, a door entered, a decision made. The sequence unfolded with a mechanical inevitability that left little room for innocence. When confronted with this reconstruction, the suspect's demeanor shifted from defensive to brittle. They accused the police of forcing patterns, of retrofitting chaos into coherence. They invoked lawyers more frequently now, leaning on procedure as armor. Interviews grew shorter. Answers grew colder. Behind the scenes, prosecutors weighed their options. The case was strong, stronger than anyone had expected, but still vulnerable. Defense teams would attack the age of the evidence, the reliability of memory, the ethics of reinterpretation. Every step forward risked being framed as overreach. Public pressure intensified. The media, sensing proximity to something definitive, sharpened its language. Articles dissected the fingerprint, the footsteps, the dust, turning forensic nuance into narrative certainty. Comment sections filled with verdicts delivered by strangers who had never seen the file but felt entitled to closure. The suspect's life became a series of headlines, their past scrutinized for meaning it may or may not have held. Friends distanced themselves. Invitations stopped coming. Silence replaced familiarity. The community that had once absorbed the shock quietly now processed it loudly, collectively, as if volume alone could compensate for lost time. The victim's family watched all of this from a distance that felt both protective and isolating. They were consulted, informed, updated, but never fully included in the machinery grinding toward a conclusion. They carried their own timeline, one measured not in evidence but in absence, in holidays without a familiar face, in years that had passed without answers. One family member, speaking privately to investigators, said something that lingered long after the conversation ended. They said the worst part of not knowing wasn't the pain. It was the doubt, the endless reimagining, the fear that the truth, whatever it was, might be more ordinary than the nightmares they had constructed to survive. As the investigation neared a critical decision point, a final review of the original case file revealed one more inconsistency, small but unsettling. A log entry indicated that an item had been collected at the scene and later marked untraceable. No description, no explanation, just a gap where an object should have been. The officers who had worked the scene were tracked down, their memories tested against documentation. One remembered it vaguely, something overlooked, something assumed irrelevant. Personal item, perhaps, nothing worth preserving. In 1991, with limited storage and overwhelming caseloads, such judgments were common. Now, they felt catastrophic. The missing item could not be recovered. It existed only as an absence, a reminder that the past was never as complete as it pretended to be. Defense teams seized on it immediately, framing it as proof of investigative incompetence, a fatal flaw that undermined everything else. The prosecutors hesitated. Charging someone with a crime this old required not just confidence but conviction. It required believing that the story they were about to tell could survive skepticism, fatigue, and the simple human resistance to reopening closed chapters. They asked themselves whether justice delayed could still be justice delivered, or whether it risked becoming something else entirely. Meanwhile, the suspect waited. They continued to insist on their version of events, now carefully curated, legally fortified. They avoided cameras, avoided questions, but those close to them noticed changes they couldn't explain. Restlessness, irritability, a fixation on minor details, the kind of behavior that suggested a mind under siege not from police but from memory. Because memory, unlike evidence, does not degrade predictably. It resurfaces at inconvenient moments. It intrudes, corrects itself. One evening, as detectives prepared briefing materials for what could become the most consequential decision of their careers, a call came in from an unexpected source. Someone who had not been on any list. Someone who had read the coverage and recognized a detail they could no longer ignore. They said they had seen something in 1991. Not the crime, not the suspect directly, but something adjacent. A person leaving the building, adjusting their coat, brushing dust from their sleeve with a gesture that had seemed meaningless at the time. They had never come forward because no one had asked. Now they were asking if it was too late. The room went quiet as the implications settled in. After decades of silence, after evidence aged and stories hardened, the case was still moving, still shifting, still capable of surprise. The cold case was not just alive. It was resisting closure, demanding to be understood on its own terms. And somewhere within that resistance lay the final test. Whether the truth, once finally cornered, would choose to reveal itself, or whether it would retreat one last time into the shadows of a city that had learned how to live with unanswered questions. It was never too late for memory, only too uncomfortable, and as the new witness sat down across from investigators, hands folded tightly as if holding something fragile inside, it became clear that time had not erased what they had seen. It had merely dulled the urgency, softened the edges until silence felt easier than interruption. They spoke slowly, carefully, not because they doubted themselves, but because they understood the danger of being precise after so many years. They described the night in fragments. The hour was late, the building unusually quiet. They had been awake, restless, listening to the city breathe through open windows. Then movement. Footsteps on the stairs, quick, purposeful, not the meandering steps of someone lost or drunk, but the direct rhythm of someone leaving with intent. They remembered the coat most clearly, dark, heavy, the way the person tugged at the sleeve, brushing something away, annoyed, almost angry, as if the dust clung longer than expected. Concrete dust. They hadn't known what it was then. They only knew it didn't belong on a clean coat. The gesture had stuck with them, a visual punctuation mark at the end of an otherwise forgettable night. When they saw the headlines decades later, when they read about stairwells and resurfacing and trace particles, the memory snapped into focus with unsettling clarity. Investigators listened without interruption. They did not lead, did not correct. They let the witness build the scene in their own words, because authenticity lives in inconsistency, in the places where memory hesitates and then insists. When asked about height, build, posture, the description aligned again, not perfectly but enough to tighten the net another notch. This time, there was no way to dismiss it as contamination. The statement was documented, corroborated where possible, placed carefully alongside the others. No single testimony was decisive, but together they were becoming overwhelming. The case was no longer about whether the suspect could have been there. It was about how many independent paths led to the same conclusion. The suspect was informed of the new witness. They reacted differently than before. Not with anger, not with dismissal, with silence. A long pause, eyes fixed on a point just beyond the room, as if listening to something no one else could hear. When they spoke again, their voice was lower, slower, stripped of its earlier confidence. They said witnesses misremember. They said the mind fills gaps with suggestion. They said grief infects objectivity. They did not deny the coat. That omission was noted. Prosecutors convened again, this time without hesitation. The case had crossed an invisible threshold, from fragile reconstruction to cohesive narrative. The fingerprint placed the suspect inside. The dust placed them in motion. The footsteps placed them in time. The witness placed them leaving. It was enough to move forward. Charges were prepared quietly, deliberately, mindful of the scrutiny to come. No leaks, no announcements. Just paperwork, signatures, and the heavy understanding that once this was set in motion, it could not be undone. When the warrant was finally approved, it felt less like a victory and more like an admission, an acknowledgement that the past had finally caught up. The arrest was uneventful. No resistance. No spectacle. Just a knock on a door in a neighborhood that had no idea it was about to become a footnote in history. The suspect answered calmly, listened, nodded, and complied. The look on their face was not shock, but recognition, as if some internal countdown had finally reached zero. News broke within hours. The city reacted in waves. First disbelief, then outrage, then the inevitable division between those who believed justice had arrived and those who warned against celebrating too soon. Commentators argued about the reliability of old evidence, about the morality of prosecuting someone after a lifetime had passed, about whether closure was a real thing or just a comforting myth. The victim's family was notified before the headlines went live. They received the news in a quiet room, accompanied by people who had carried the case longer than anyone. There were tears, but not the kind expected. Not relief, not joy, just release. A loosening of something that had been clenched for decades. Still, the case was far from over. Defense attorneys moved aggressively, filing motions to suppress evidence, challenging the chain of custody, questioning the integrity of the original investigation. They painted a picture of institutional failure, of a system so flawed in 1991 that any conclusions drawn from it now were inherently suspect. They argued that the fingerprint, the very heart of the case, had survived too many hands, too many moves, too many chances to be compromised. Every claim was examined, every process audited. Evidence logs were re-verified, seals rechecked, storage conditions documented. The fingerprint held. The dust analysis held. The witness statements, while aged, held together under scrutiny. The case bent, but it did not break. In court filings, the phrase cold case appeared repeatedly, framed alternately as a testament to perseverance and as a warning against overconfidence. The defense leaned heavily on doubt, on the idea that time itself was the real defendant, eroding certainty beyond repair. But time cuts both ways, because as the trial date approached, something unexpected happened. Another memory surfaced, this time from someone closer to the suspect, someone who had lived with the shadow of that night without ever understanding why. They came forward reluctantly, burdened by loyalty and fear, carrying a detail they had dismissed as trivial for years. They remembered the night after the murder. They remembered the suspect coming home later than usual, quiet, distracted. They remembered the coat, hung carefully, brushed clean, as if effort had been taken to remove something unwanted. They remembered being told not to ask questions. At the time, it had seemed insignificant. Now, it felt impossible to ignore. This testimony was different. It did not rely on public memory or media influence. It came from the interior of a life, from a space where performance drops and habits reveal themselves. It added an emotional dimension the case had lacked, a human texture that no forensic analysis could replicate. The defense fought to exclude it. The court allowed it provisionally. The trial loomed, heavy with expectation, not just as a legal proceeding, but as a referendum on whether the past could still speak with authority, whether a city built on layers of reinvention could confront a truth it had postponed for 30 years. And beneath all of it, steady and unchanging, the fingerprint waited, still pressed into glass, still saying the same thing it had always said, indifferent to debate, immune to doubt, a quiet reminder that some actions, no matter how carefully executed, never truly disappear. The courtroom did not feel like a place built for truth. It felt like a place built for endurance. And as the trial began, everyone inside understood they were about to test how much weight 30 years could carry without collapsing. The air was dense with anticipation, with the unspoken agreement that whatever happened here would echo far beyond the verdict. Because this was no longer just a murder case, it was a reckoning with time itself. The suspect sat quietly at the defense table, posture composed, eyes forward, a study in restraint. They had aged into anonymity, the kind that allows people to move through life without being examined too closely. And now that anonymity was gone, stripped away by headlines and whispered conversations. Yet there was no visible panic, only a careful stillness, the calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment privately for years. The prosecution opened without theatrics. They did not raise their voice. They did not dramatize. They spoke as if laying bricks, one by one, building a structure meant to hold. They began with Berlin in 1991, not as nostalgia, but as context, a city fractured and uncertain, where systems were overwhelmed and attention was scarce. They explained how a crime could slip through the cracks not because it was unsolvable, but because the moment was not ready to solve it. Then they introduced the fingerprint, projected large, magnified until every ridge and valley filled the room. It looked almost abstract, a piece of accidental art. The prosecutor let it linger, letting the jurors absorb the fact that this pattern had been lifted from a glass on the night of the murder, preserved through decades of upheaval, and finally matched using technology that did not exist when the crime was committed. They did not call it destiny. They called it persistence. Expert witnesses followed, their language precise, restrained, almost dull, which made it more convincing. They explained probability, methodology, safeguards against contamination. They explained why the match mattered not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. The defense cross-examined aggressively, attacking assumptions, highlighting margins of error, suggesting alternatives. The experts did not flinch. They acknowledged limitations without surrendering ground. Then came the stairwell. Photographs of concrete surfaces, diagrams of lighting angles, maintenance logs projected onto screens, all serving one purpose: to place a person in motion at a specific time. The dust analysis was presented carefully, not as a smoking gun, but as connective tissue. Dust does not lie, the prosecutor said quietly. It only travels where people do. Witnesses took the stand one by one, their voices carrying the weight of years spent doubting themselves. They spoke of footsteps, of pauses, of sounds that had meant nothing until they meant everything. The defense pressed hard, pointing out inconsistencies, the frailty of memory, the danger of suggestion. Some witnesses faltered, others held steady. None claimed certainty. Together, they offered something more unsettling: convergence. The most difficult testimony came from inside the suspect's own life. The person who remembered the coat, the late return, the unspoken rule not to ask questions, spoke with visible strain. Loyalty and fear pulled in opposite directions. The defense questioned their motives, their timing, their credibility. Why now, after all these years? The answer was simple and devastating, because now it finally made sense. Throughout it all, the suspect remained controlled, occasionally whispering to counsel, occasionally closing their eyes as if resting. When they took the stand, the room tightened. They spoke well, calmly, reasonably. They acknowledged inconsistencies without admitting guilt. They framed their earlier omissions as survival, not deception. They described a life shaped by caution, by the belief that visibility was dangerous. They denied violence, denied intent, denied responsibility. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor did not accuse. They asked the same questions that had haunted the investigation for years. Why the fingerprint was there, why the alibi changed, why the coat had been brushed so carefully. Each question was met with an explanation. None were implausible, all were fragile. And then came the pause. A silence stretched longer than expected, as the prosecutor asked one final question, not about evidence, but about memory, about whether the suspect remembered the glass. Not the fingerprint, the glass itself. The answer came after a beat too long. Yes, they remembered it. That moment rippled through the room. Closing arguments were restrained, almost subdued, as if everyone understood that persuasion had already done what it could. The prosecution spoke of accumulation, of how truth rarely arrives all at once, but instead announces itself gradually, through repetition and resistance. The defense warned against nostalgia masquerading as justice, against convicting someone based on a story rebuilt from fragments. The jury deliberated longer than anyone predicted. Hours stretched into days. Outside, cameras waited. Commentators speculated. The city held its breath, not because it craved punishment, but because it needed to know whether the past could still be held accountable. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom filled again. Tension compressed into a single moment. The jury foreperson stood, voice steady, words measured. Guilty. The sound was not explosive. It was quiet, almost anticlimactic. The suspect did not react visibly. No outburst, no collapse, just a slow exhale, as if something heavy had finally been set down. Sentencing would come later. Appeals would follow. The legal process would continue, methodical and unsentimental. But in that moment, something shifted. Not closure, not peace, something more complicated. The victim's family wept softly, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. The detectives who had carried the case felt a mixture of pride and unease, aware that resolution did not erase the years of waiting, only acknowledged them. The city absorbed the news, folding it into its already crowded history. Outside, life continued. Trains ran, cafes filled. Berlin did what it always did, it moved forward. But somewhere, deep in the architecture of memory, the cold case finally released its grip, not with a scream, but with a whisper, leaving behind a question that would linger long after the courtroom emptied. How many truths were still out there, waiting patiently, not to be discovered, but to be believed? The verdict did not end the noise, it changed its pitch, and in the days that followed, Berlin processed the outcome the way it processes everything else, by talking, by arguing, by turning certainty into debate and debate into something resembling culture. The word guilty traveled fast, faster than nuance, faster than restraint, and soon it was stitched into headlines, folded into commentary, weaponized by those who needed it to mean something definitive in a world that rarely offers that luxury. Inside the justice system, the work continued without ceremony. Sentencing briefs were drafted, timelines recalculated, precedents cited. The defense filed its appeal almost immediately, not as an act of defiance but as a reflex, the final movement in a long choreography of procedure. They challenged the fingerprint again, the witness testimony again, the dust analysis again, insisting that time itself had contaminated the process beyond repair. Outside the courtroom, the victim's name resurfaced everywhere, spoken by people who had never known them, attached to a story larger than the life it had interrupted. Old photographs were republished. Biographical details were compressed into digestible fragments. A person became a symbol, and with that transformation came a quiet unease among those who had actually loved them, because symbols are static and grief is not. The detectives were asked to speak publicly now, to explain the case, to defend the investigation. They chose their words carefully, aware that every sentence would be parsed for doubt. They emphasized patience, method, accumulation. They spoke about the fingerprint not as a miracle, but as a reminder that evidence waits, even when people do not. Privately, the mood was more complicated. Some investigators slept better than they had in years. Others did not sleep at all. The relief of resolution competed with the discomfort of retrospection. Could this have been solved earlier? Had opportunities been missed not because of malice, but because of momentum, because history had simply been moving too fast? The suspect, now a convicted murderer, sat alone more often than not, awaiting sentencing in a place where time slows to a crawl. Their visitors were few, their conversations brief. Lawyers came and went, carrying documents thick with language designed to create space where none seemed to remain. They maintained their innocence, quietly, consistently, as if repetition itself could carve out doubt. In interviews granted through counsel, they framed the trial as a failure of restraint, a story shaped by hindsight, by a system eager to prove that nothing truly escapes it. They did not rage. They did not plead. They positioned themselves as a casualty of narrative, a life crushed beneath the weight of a fingerprint that had become too powerful to question. These statements found an audience, not large but vocal. Commentators emerged who warned against celebrating cold case convictions, who argued that the romance of delayed justice could blind societies to error. They pointed to overturned verdicts elsewhere, to the fragility of memory, to the seduction of coherence. They asked uncomfortable questions, not about this case specifically, but about what it represented. The debate spilled into universities, into law journals, into quiet conversations between professionals who had devoted their lives to separating truth from certainty. The Berlin 1991 cold case became a case study, dissected not for its crime, but for its process, its implications, its warning. Meanwhile, the family tried to live again. They visited the grave. They closed old boxes. They answered questions they had never expected to hear. Some felt lighter. Others felt strangely hollow, as if the space once occupied by not knowing had been filled not with peace, but with something sharper, more permanent. One family member admitted something they had never said aloud before. That part of them had hoped the case would remain unsolved. That uncertainty had allowed imagination, had softened the edges of reality. Now, the truth sat there, heavy and immovable, demanding to be carried. As sentencing approached, the prosecution submitted a final piece of analysis, almost an afterthought, but one that carried symbolic weight. A forensic review of the glass itself, not the fingerprint, but the object, its origin, its manufacture date, its distribution. It confirmed what investigators had long suspected. The glass was not from the victim's home. It had been brought there. The implication was simple and devastating. The suspect had not just been present. They had arrived prepared. The defense objected to its inclusion. The court allowed it to stand as context, not as a deciding factor. Still, its presence reshaped perception. Preparation suggested intent. Intent narrowed the story further, stripping away ambiguity. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom filled again, though the tension was different now, less volatile, more resigned. The judge spoke of responsibility, of the endurance of harm, of the idea that time does not absolve action. The sentence was firm, calibrated, severe enough to acknowledge loss without pretending it could compensate for it. The suspect listened without expression. When given the opportunity to speak, they said very little. They denied the crime one last time. They said history would judge the case differently. They sat down. And just like that, it was over. Or so it seemed. In the weeks that followed, a strange quiet settled around the case. Media attention drifted. New stories replaced old ones. The machinery of public interest moved on, as it always does. But beneath that surface calm, something continued to stir. A researcher reviewing archival material for an unrelated project noticed an anomaly in early case documentation. A discrepancy so small it had escaped attention for decades. A timestamp, a handwritten correction, a minor inconsistency that did not contradict the verdict, but did not align perfectly with it either. They flagged it, not out of suspicion but curiosity. The note was passed along quietly, moving through channels that had learned to respect restraint. Investigators reviewed it, compared it, contextualized it. It did not exonerate. It did not accuse. It simply refused to sit comfortably within the now official narrative. The cold case, it seemed, was not finished with them yet. Because even after a verdict, after a sentence, after a city collectively exhaled, truth does not always resolve into a clean shape. Sometimes it lingers not as doubt, but as friction, a reminder that understanding is not the same as knowing, and that the past, once reopened, rarely agrees to be closed again without leaving something behind. The discrepancy was small enough to be dangerous, the kind that lives quietly at the bottom of a page, unremarkable unless you are looking for reasons not to be satisfied, and once it was noticed, it refused to be unseen. A timestamp corrected by hand, a number overwritten, then initialed. In 1991, such edits were common, almost expected. Paper moved faster than verification. Precision was aspirational. But now, under the weight of a conviction, the correction felt heavier than it should have. The researchers who found it did not announce their discovery. They did not speculate. They did what the case had always demanded. They followed procedure. The document was cross-checked against others from the same night. Logs, reports, call sheets. Slowly, a pattern emerged, not of fabrication but of compression. Times rounded.
Moments marge.
A sequence simplified to fit the limits of the tools available at the time. The question was not whether the crime had occurred. That was settled. The question was whether the timeline, as it had been presented to the jury, was the only one possible. Investigators revisited the phone booth call again, the hinge on which so much of the reconstruction turned. The call duration had always been clear. The location had always been fixed. But the precise moment it ended, the exact second when the receiver was returned to its cradle, was less certain than anyone had admitted. The discrepancy suggested a window slightly wider than previously believed. Not enough to dismantle the case. Enough to complicate it. Defense attorneys noticed the shift immediately. They seized on it, filing supplemental motions, framing the discovery as evidence of narrative inflation, arguing that the prosecution had compressed uncertainty into inevitability. They did not claim innocence outright. They claimed distortion. And distortion, they argued, was enough to warrant reconsideration. Public reaction was swift and polarized. To some, the new detail was proof of everything they had feared, that the case had been driven by momentum rather than restraint. To others, it was noise, an academic exercise exploited by those unwilling to accept responsibility. The phrase Berlin cold case re-entered the news cycle, this time paired with words like challenge and review. The court agreed to examine the issue. Not a retrial, not an acquittal, a review, narrow, technical, focused, the kind of process that does not generate spectacle but can quietly reshape outcomes. Experts were called again, this time to speak not about guilt, but about sequence, about whether the margin of error introduced by the discrepancy materially altered the story told at trial. The fingerprint remained untouched by this debate. It still placed the suspect in the apartment. It still contradicted their original account. No correction, no rounding, no clerical inconsistency could explain it away. But the timeline was the spine of the prosecution's narrative, and even a slight bend in the spine could change posture, perspective, emphasis. The victim's family felt the ground shift beneath them again. They had thought the hardest part was over. That uncertainty had finally been replaced by something solid. Now they were being asked to endure another chapter, another waiting period, another possibility that resolution might not be as final as it had seemed. Some were angry. Others were simply tired. All of them were wary of hope. The convicted individual watched this unfold from a distance, following updates through counsel, their expression unchanged. To some, their calm suggested guilt hardened into resignation. To others, it suggested patience, the long-game endurance of someone who had already outlasted the system once before. Inside the investigative team, reactions were mixed. Younger members saw the review as a necessary safeguard, proof that the system could question itself without collapsing. Veterans felt a familiar ache, the sense that certainty was always provisional, that even the strongest cases lived under constant negotiation with doubt. They re-examined everything, not defensively, but meticulously. They wanted to know, genuinely, whether they had pushed too hard, whether the desire to close the case had sharpened edges that should have remained rough. The answer, frustratingly, was both yes and no. The timeline could stretch. The sequence could breathe. But the convergence remained. The footsteps still aligned. The dust still traveled. The witness still remembered the coat. The fingerprint still spoke. Experts testified that even with a widened window, the probability landscape did not change meaningfully. The suspect still had opportunity, still had access, still had no credible explanation for the physical evidence. The story became less elegant, more granular, but no less persuasive. The review concluded without overturning the conviction. The court acknowledged the discrepancy, criticized the original documentation practices of the era, and affirmed the verdict. The decision was careful, almost clinical, its language designed to reassure without overpromising. Justice, it suggested, was not perfection but sufficiency. The news cycle reacted with less intensity this time. Fatigue had set in. The public's appetite for nuance was limited. Many accepted the outcome with a shrug, others with quiet satisfaction, a few with lingering resentment. But one person did not let it go. A journalist who had covered the case from the beginning, drawn to its layers rather than its conclusion, returned to the original interviews, the early statements, the things people had said before the story had a shape. In those raw transcripts, they noticed something odd. A phrase repeated by multiple witnesses, almost identically, when describing the night. Not the crime, the weather. They all remembered rain. Official records said it had been dry. At first, the discrepancy seemed trivial, another memory warped by time. But when the journalist cross-referenced personal diaries, local news footage, even amateur photographs from that night, a different picture emerged. A brief, unrecorded shower. Light, short-lived, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Rain changes things, changes sound, it changes movement, it changes how dust behaves, how footprints fade, how evidence travels. It complicates reconstruction in subtle ways that only matter if you are paying very close attention. The journalist published nothing. Instead, they asked questions. And those questions, quiet and persistent, began to circulate in places where answers still mattered, suggesting that the story of Berlin 1991, for all its verdicts and sentences, still had one more layer to reveal, one more truth to negotiate between what was known, what was proven, and what was merely believed. Rain is an eraser that never fully cleans the page, and once the possibility entered the conversation, it changed the way every earlier assumption sounded, because if there had been rain, even briefly, then the night was not as clean as it had been presented, not as acoustically sharp, not as forensically obedient. Rain bends timelines without announcing itself. It softens footsteps. It darkens fabric. It carries dust where it should not go and washes it away where it should remain. The journalist followed the rain the way investigators had once followed the fingerprint, patiently, methodically, without demanding that it prove anything on its own. They gathered fragments. A local radio weather segment mentioning isolated drizzle. A maintenance worker's log noting a slick stairwell the following morning. A grainy home video from a nearby street, time-stamped within the window of the crime, showing umbrellas briefly blooming and then vanishing again. It was not enough to overturn a conviction. It was enough to unsettle the story. The journalists brought their findings to forensic consultants, not to accuse, but to ask what rain would change. The answers were cautious, technical, unsatisfying in the way real answers often are. Rain could reduce dust transfer, but not eliminate it. Rain could alter sound perception, but not invent footsteps. Rain could complicate reconstruction, but it could not place a fingerprint where no hand had been. Still, the cumulative effect was undeniable. The case had been built on convergence, on the alignment of independent elements, and rain introduced variance, not chaos but noise. The kind of noise that makes certainty feel louder than it should be. The defense took notice. They filed another motion, not to reopen the trial, but to expand the scope of review, arguing that environmental conditions had been mischaracterized, that the narrative presented to the jury had implied a clarity the night did not possess. It was a subtle argument, designed not to prove innocence, but to undermine inevitability. The court declined. This time, the refusal was firmer. The judge cited the threshold of relevance, the danger of infinite regression, the necessity of finality. Law, the ruling implied, cannot chase every shadow without eventually losing the shape of justice itself. The decision stood. And yet, something had shifted again, not legally, but culturally. The case began to be discussed less as a solved crime and more as a lesson, a meditation on evidence, time, and belief. In lecture halls and panel discussions, the Berlin 1991 cold case was invoked not for its conclusion, but for its process. The fingerprint became an icon, both of hope and of warning, a symbol of science's power and its limits. The victim's family felt this shift acutely. They were grateful the conviction held, grateful the appeals were thinning, but they were exhausted by the case's refusal to settle into silence. Each new article, each new analysis, reopened the wound just enough to sting. Closure, they learned, is not a moment. It is a negotiation you must keep renegotiating with the world. The convicted individual followed the Rain discourse with quiet intensity. They told their lawyer it proved something, though what exactly they could not articulate. That the story had been rushed. That the night had been misunderstood. That truth, like weather, had layers. Their words did not change their circumstances, but they sharpened their internal narrative, the one that allowed them to survive the long hours where nothing happens and memory becomes the only companion. Inside the police department, the case was gradually archived again, this time with annotations, caveats, footnotes acknowledging what had been learned after the fact. It was no longer just a file. It was a record of evolution, of how institutions learn, adapt, and sometimes overcorrect. One investigator, nearing retirement, returned to the apartment building one last time. They stood in the stairwell, now brightly lit, immaculately clean, and listened. There were no echoes anymore, no uncertainty in sound. The city had polished this place until it no longer remembered what it had once held. They imagined rain tapping faintly against windows, imagined footsteps softened, imagined how easy it would be to misjudge a moment, to underestimate a detail. They did not doubt the verdict, but they no longer believed in simple endings. The journalist eventually published a long-form piece, careful in tone, restrained in conclusion. They did not argue for innocence. They argued for humility, for acknowledging that even when justice is served, understanding remains provisional. The piece was widely read, quietly influential, and deeply unsettling to anyone who wanted certainty without cost. As years passed, the case settled into a different kind of cold. Not unsolved, not unresolved, but unresolved in spirit, a story that refused to harden into myth. Students studied it, professionals cited it. The public remembered it dimly, as one remembers a warning sign passed too quickly to read in full. And beneath all of it, unchanged, unargued, unweathered, the fingerprint remained. It did not care about rain. It did not care about narrative. It did not care about doubt. It existed as it always had, pressed into glass at a moment of choice, a silent record of contact between a person and a place, reminding anyone willing to listen that while stories can bend and timelines can stretch, some marks endure, waiting not for agreement, but for reckoning. The only question left was whether that reckoning belonged to the past, or to everyone who believed the case was finished simply because the law had decided to move on. There is a moment in every cold case when silence becomes louder than evidence, when the absence of new facts begins to speak its own language, and Berlin 1991 reached that moment slowly, almost politely, fading from headlines not with a conclusion but with a collective exhale, as if the city itself had decided that remembering too vividly was more dangerous than forgetting imperfectly. Years passed. The apartment building changed hands again. The stairwell was repainted. The windows were replaced. New tenants learned nothing of the night that had once spent time inside those walls, because cities, like people, survive by editing their memories. What cannot be erased is covered. What cannot be covered is normalized. What cannot be normalized is buried beneath routine. But the case never truly slept. In archives and databases, in footnotes and training manuals, Berlin 1991 remained awake, its fingerprints still scanned, still matched against new systems as technology advanced, not because investigators expected a different answer, but because procedure demanded vigilance. Cold cases, even broken ones, are never fully closed. They are paused, breathing quietly in the background, waiting for something to shift. For the victim's family, life moved forward in uneven steps. They learned how to speak of the loss without collapsing, how to attend birthdays and weddings with a space permanently reserved for someone who would never arrive. The conviction gave them structure, a frame around the grief, but it did not give them peace. Peace, they discovered, is not delivered by verdicts. It is built slowly, privately, from acceptance that never feels complete. Sometimes they wondered about the rain. Sometimes they wondered about the fingerprint. Most of the time, they wondered about nothing at all because wondering costs energy, and grief already takes more than it gives back. The convicted individual aged behind walls designed to slow time. Their appeals exhausted themselves quietly, denied without drama, footnoted into legal history. They maintained their version of events, not loudly, not defiantly, but steadily, as if repetition itself could substitute for proof. To some guards, they were polite. To others, distant. To everyone, they were part of the furniture, another long-term sentence moving through the predictable rhythms of incarceration. When asked years later what they thought about the fingerprint, they said only that objects remember differently than people do. It was not a defense. It was an observation. Outside, the journalist who had chased the rain moved on to other stories, other mysteries. But Berlin 1991 remained the case they could not quite leave behind. In interviews, when asked why, they struggled to answer without sounding unsatisfied, because the dissatisfaction was the point. The case had taught them that resolution is often a social agreement, not a universal truth, that we stop asking questions not when they are answered, but when the cost of asking becomes too high. The fingerprint, meanwhile, became something else entirely. In forensic conferences, it was projected onto screens, enlarged, analyzed, admired. A near-perfect impression. Clean ridges. Clear bifurcations. A gift, instructors called it, the kind of evidence detectives dream of. Students were taught how rare it was, how decisive it had been, how it had rewritten history. Few lectures mentioned the rain. Fewer mentioned the timeline discrepancies. Almost none mentioned how close the case had come to being remembered differently. This is how stories solidify. Edges smooth, contradictions fade, complexity collapses into clarity. And the public, hungry for endings, accepts the simplified version because it fits neatly into the shape we expect justice to take. But somewhere between the official record and the lived memory, the case continued to exist as it always had. Unresolved in feeling, resolved in law, suspended between certainty and doubt. Berlin itself absorbed the lesson without naming it. The city learned to trust science and question it, to believe in progress and remain cautious, to celebrate solved cases while acknowledging that every solution casts a shadow. Crime rates rose and fell. Technologies improved. New cold cases emerged, each one promising, implicitly, that the past could be mastered if only the right detail were found. And sometimes it was. Sometimes a fingerprint really did rewrite history. But rewriting is not the same as restoring. What was lost in 1991 was never returned. What was broken was never fully repaired. The case offered accountability, not absolution. Explanation, not understanding. It answered the question of who without ever satisfying the deeper question of why, or the most unsettling one of all, whether knowing is always better than not knowing. In the end, Berlin 1991 became a mirror. For investigators, it reflected discipline and fallibility. For journalists, it reflected responsibility and restraint. For the public, it reflected the uneasy bargain we make with the justice system, accepting imperfection in exchange for order. And for anyone who looks too closely at that fingerprint, those ridges frozen in time, it reflects something simpler and more disturbing. The idea that a single touch, a moment of contact, can outlive memory, outlast denial, and define a life more permanently than any story told afterward. The case no longer asks to be solved. It asks to be remembered correctly, not as a triumph, not as a failure, but as what it truly was. A collision between certainty and doubt, between science and story, between the need for closure and the reality that some nights never fully end. They only recede, leaving behind impressions that refuse to fade, waiting patiently for whoever comes next to decide what they mean. Long after the case stopped appearing in court filings and lecture slides, after the last appeal deadline passed unnoticed and the last television panel moved on to fresher tragedies, Berlin 1991 continued to echo in quieter places, in the spaces where certainty is not required but memory insists on being heard. It surfaced in late-night conversations between detectives who no longer carried badges, in the careful pauses of professors who knew when not to answer a student's question too cleanly, in the private thoughts of people who had lived close enough to the crime to feel its gravity without ever touching it. The fingerprint was still there. Every few years it was rescanned, revalidated against new standards, its ridges translated into ever more precise digital language, not because anyone expected a different result, but because systems are built on repetition. Each scan reaffirmed what had already been decided. Each confirmation added another layer of technical confidence to a conclusion that had long since escaped the emotional realm. And yet, confidence did not quiet the unease. A new generation of investigators studied the case without the burden of having lived through it. To them, 1991 was an abstraction, a pre-digital fog where procedures were slower and documentation thinner. They saw the mistakes more easily, the ambiguities more clearly. They also saw the discipline, the patience, the refusal to abandon a case simply because it had grown old. In their discussions, Berlin 1991 became a balancing act, an example of how persistence can save justice, and how persistence can also blind it. The city itself barely noticed. Berlin had reinvented itself too many times to linger on one unresolved feeling. Streets were renamed, buildings repurposed, neighborhoods transformed until geography itself felt like a suggestion rather than a fact. The crime scene existed now only as an address, stripped of context, its past invisible to anyone not actively searching for it. But memory has a way of resisting urban renewal. An elderly neighbor, interviewed decades later for an unrelated project, mentioned the night in passing. Not the crime, not the fingerprint, not the trial. Just the feeling. The way the building seemed to hold its breath. The way people spoke more softly for weeks afterward. The way fear did not announce itself loudly, but settled into habits, into glances over shoulders, into doors locked a second time. Fear, unlike evidence, does not need preservation to endure. For the victim's family, the case eventually stopped being a chapter and became a background condition. It shaped their lives without actively intruding on them. They marked time differently. Before, after. Everything else was detail. When asked, they spoke of justice with caution, not because they doubted it, but because they had learned how fragile the word could be when stretched across decades. Sometimes they imagined the night differently. Sometimes they wondered if knowing more would have helped, or if it would only have sharpened the pain. They did not seek answers anymore. They sought balance. And balance, they learned, does not come from perfect explanations, but from the ability to live alongside unanswered questions without letting them consume the present. The convicted individual remained where the system had placed them. Years of confinement flattened time into routine. Memory became both refuge and threat. They replayed the night endlessly, not because they believed it would change anything, but because it was the only moment of their life that still mattered to anyone else. When they spoke of the case, they did so in fragments, observations rather than arguments, as if even they understood that stories harden when repeated too often. They were no longer fighting the verdict. They were living inside it. The journalist returned to Berlin once more, long after their article had faded from public consciousness. They walked the streets without notes, without an agenda, listening instead to the city's indifference. It was comforting, in a way, proof that life does not pause for unresolved narratives. Proof that meaning is not always collective, that sometimes it exists only in the tension between what we know and what we choose to accept. They stood outside the building and felt nothing dramatic.
No chill, no revelación.
Just the ordinary weight of a place that had outlived its moment of significance. That, more than anything, unsettled them. The realization that history does not announce itself, that the past does not glow, that even the most scrutinized locations eventually return to anonymity. This, perhaps, was the final truth of Berlin 1991. Not that it had been solved or not solved, not that justice had been done or merely approximated, but that meaning erodes faster than evidence. That fingerprints can last longer than outrage. That systems crave conclusions even when reality resists them. The case no longer demanded attention. It lingered instead, like a low-frequency hum beneath the noise of new crimes and new promises, reminding those who listened closely that certainty is always provisional, that every answer is shaped by the tools and assumptions of its time, and that history is not rewritten in bold strokes, but in quiet revisions that most people never notice. Somewhere in a database, the fingerprint waited, not for redemption, not for reversal, but as a reminder that the past does not disappear when we declare it finished, that it simply changes form, becoming less visible, less urgent, but no less present. A single touch, preserved against decay, holding its position between truth and interpretation, asking nothing, explaining nothing, existing as proof that even when a cold case is said to be broken, its coldness never fully thaws. It settles instead into the bones of a city, into the practices of institutions, into the stories we tell ourselves about justice and progress, leaving behind a quiet, persistent question that no verdict can silence, only postpone. When we say we know what happened, are we describing the truth, or the version of it we are finally willing to live with? Eventually, even echoes learn how to blend into the background, and Berlin 1991 reached that stage not with resolution, but with familiarity, the kind that dulls urgency without erasing significance. The case stopped being a headline, stopped being a cautionary tale delivered with raised voices, and became instead a reference point, a quiet coordinate in the collective map of crimes that taught the system who it was, and who it was not. New cold cases arrived. They always do. Different streets, different victims, different technologies promising clarity where the past had failed. Each one carried the same unspoken vow. This time, nothing will be missed. This time, every detail will be preserved. This time, the story will end cleanly. And for a while, people believed it because belief is easier than remembering how often certainty has aged badly. The fingerprint was rarely mentioned now. When it appeared stripped of narrative, reduced to data points and ridge counts, an artifact of success. In training rooms, instructors spoke of it briskly, efficiently, as something already understood. There was no room left for hesitation, no space for the rain, the timeline, the atmosphere of that night. Complexity had been archived along with the rest. This is how systems protect themselves. They remember outcomes better than processes. They preserve conclusions more carefully than questions. Somewhere in the city, a former detective watched these new cases unfold on the evening news, noting the familiar rhythm. The initial shock, the promises, the press conferences heavy with confidence. They did not feel cynical. They felt cautious. Experience had not stripped them of belief in justice, only of belief in simplicity. They knew now that every solved case casts a long shadow backward, over the unsolved ones, over the decisions that could have gone differently, over the details that only become important after time teaches us how to see them. Berlin 1991 was one of those shadows. It followed quietly, lengthening as the sun of certainty moved across it. The victim's name was still spoken occasionally, usually by people too young to remember the crime itself. To them, the name belonged to a story already finished, a tragedy with a defined arc. They did not know the pauses, the delays, the years where nothing happened and everything mattered. They inherited the conclusion without the waiting, the answer without the cost. And perhaps that was inevitable. No society can carry every unresolved feeling forward intact. Some things must be simplified to survive transmission. But something is always lost in that simplification. Something human, something fragile, something that does not fit neatly into evidence bags or verdicts. The convicted individual grew older still. Their body changed in ways their identity did not. They became, in the eyes of the institution, a completed case, a closed file embodied in flesh. New inmates arrived with louder stories, fresher wounds, and the past receded further into the background of daily routine. When they thought of Berlin 1991 now, it felt less like a night and more like a concept, an idea others had constructed around a moment they alone remembered in full. Whether that memory aligned with reality no longer mattered. Memory had become private, truth official. Between the two, there was no longer a bridge, only parallel lines that would never meet again. Outside, the city continued its quiet negotiation with history. Memorials were built for some losses, not for others. Certain crimes were remembered collectively, others absorbed silently into the urban bloodstream. Berlin 1991 belonged to the latter category now, present without being visible, influential without being discussed. And maybe that was its final form. Not a mystery demanding answers, not a solution demanding celebration, but a low, persistent pressure on the idea of certainty itself. Because anyone who truly studied the case long enough reached the same uncomfortable understanding. That the fingerprint did not solve everything. It solved one question decisively and made every other question more complicated. It offered clarity at a price, and the price was the illusion that clarity is the same as completeness. The case no longer waited for new evidence. It waited for interpretation. And interpretation, unlike evidence, changes with the people who inherit it. Berlin 1991 had crossed that threshold. It no longer belonged to investigators or journalists or courts. It belonged to the long conversation between past and present, between what happened and what it meant, between the desire to close the book and the reality that some stories do not end. They simply stop being told out loud. The fingerprint remained, unmoved, unchanging, a single moment preserved beyond context, beyond intention, beyond doubt, reminding anyone who encountered it that history is often rewritten not by grand revelations, but by what we choose to stop questioning. And in that choice, quiet and unremarkable, the cold case found its final resting place. Not in certainty, but in acceptance of uncertainty, where it continues to exist, unseen but intact, like a shadow that only appears when the light shifts just enough to remind us it was always there. Time does not close cases, it only rearranges them, moving questions from the center of the room to the corners, where they gather dust and wait to be noticed again, and Berlin 1991 settled into that corner with a patience that felt almost deliberate. The case did not demand revival. It did not announce new developments. It simply remained, an object left behind after everyone agreed to stop tripping over it. Then technology changed again. Not dramatically, not with headlines. Quietly, the way most revolutions arrive when they are already too embedded to resist. Pattern analysis grew subtler. Contextual modeling matured. Algorithms learned not just to match, but to compare environments, sequences, probabilities layered atop probabilities. Tools once used to confirm were now capable of questioning. Someone, somewhere in the system, ran the fingerprint again. Not because they doubted it, because the software allowed for something new, contextual isolation. The ability to model how a print could be deposited under different circumstances, different pressures, different angles, different states of mind. It did not ask who left it. It asked how it might have been left. The results were unremarkable. Mostly, the print was consistent with contact made under calm conditions. No slip, no sudden brace, no sign of struggle, a steady press, intentional or incidental, but not panicked. That conclusion aligned with what had always been assumed, and yet, seeing it articulated with modern precision unsettled something old. Because panic had been the emotional backbone of the narrative. The crime had been framed as sudden, explosive, chaotic. But the fingerprint suggested stillness, a moment of composure, a pause long enough for pressure to register evenly. It did not contradict guilt, complicated emotion. No one filed a motion. No court convened. The findings circulated internally, discussed briefly, then archived. It did not meet any legal threshold. It did not threaten the verdict. But it altered the tone in subtle ways, like a musical note slightly out of key once you know how to listen for it. The crime, it suggested, may not have unfolded the way everyone imagined. The victim's final moments, so often reconstructed with urgency and fear, now felt quieter in this version, more deliberate, more controlled. That possibility was uncomfortable. It stripped the story of some of its moral clarity, replacing it with ambiguity that did not serve justice so much as realism. And realism is rarely welcome after the fact. The family was not told. There was no reason to tell them. Nothing actionable. Nothing kind. The system, having learned restraint the hard way, chose silence. This too was a decision, one shaped by experience, by the understanding that not every truth improves the world simply by being spoken. The convicted individual never heard about it either. They continued to age within the routines of confinement, unaware that the narrative texture of their case had shifted by a fraction. Their story, whatever it truly was, had already solidified in the public imagination. New nuances could not reach them. They were sealed behind time as effectively as behind walls. And yet, in rare moments of honesty, some investigators acknowledged what the new analysis implied. That the case had always been emotionally overdetermined. That fear had filled in gaps where evidence had simply been silent. That the fingerprint, for all its authority, had been asked to carry more meaning than it strictly contained. None of this meant the wrong person had been convicted. It meant the right story might never have been told. Berlin absorbed this quietly, as it absorbed everything else. The city had lived through enough transformations to understand that truth is often provisional, that each generation inherits a version of events shaped less by facts than by the questions it knows how to ask. In 1991, the question had been who. In later years, it became how. Now, without anyone explicitly naming it, the question hovered closer to why we needed the answer to feel a certain way. Why chaos felt necessary. Why violence had to be loud. Why guilt had to look a certain way to be believed. The case no longer provoked debate. Provoked reflection. Among those who studied it deeply, there was a growing sense that Berlin 1991 had reached its final phase, not resolution but sedimentation. Layers of interpretation settling on top of one another, compacted by time, forming something solid enough to stand on but never transparent enough to see through completely. The fingerprint was still there, unchanged. It had not betrayed anyone. It had not lied. It had simply existed while people built meaning around it, adjusted that meaning, defended it, questioned it, and finally learned to live with its limits. Cold cases do not end. They cool. They pass from urgency into memory, from memory into doctrine, from doctrine into background noise. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear them humming beneath the present, a reminder that certainty is not the same as truth, and that justice, once declared, does not stop evolving in the minds of those willing to revisit it. Berlin 1991 no longer asked for attention. It asked for humility, and that, perhaps, was the last thing it would ever demand. In the end, what remains of a cold case is not the evidence, not the verdict, not even the story that survives in public memory, but the quiet recalibration it forces inside the people who encountered it closely enough to be changed. Berlin 1991 reached that point without ceremony, slipping into the long tail of influence where its power was no longer obvious, but no less real. A young investigator, newly assigned to a different case decades later, encountered the file by accident, pulled it not for guidance but for comparison, looking for patterns and failures rather than successes. They noticed how carefully later annotations had been added, how hesitant the language became as the years progressed, how certainty gave way to precision, and precision gave way to restraint. This was not how winning cases were usually documented. This was how caution learned to write. They closed the file with a feeling they could not name. Not doubt. Not belief. Something heavier. The understanding that every conclusion is a negotiation with time, and time always has more leverage. Berlin outside the window looked nothing like the city of 1991. The angles were softer. The scars were harder to see. But beneath the surface, the old structures remained, carrying forward the weight of choices made when tools were weaker and pressure was louder. Progress had not erased that weight. It had redistributed it. The fingerprint had done its job. It had pointed. It had anchored. It had ended a question the system could no longer tolerate unanswered. But it had not ended the story because stories do not belong to systems. They belong to people, and people do not process truth in straight lines. They circle it. They test it. They revisit it when new language becomes available. The victim's name still existed in records, in memories, in the quiet rituals of those who loved them. Their life was not defined by the case, but the case had come to define how their absence was understood. Justice had provided a frame, but the picture inside it remained incomplete, and perhaps always would. The convicted individual, now older than anyone expected to see them become, lived in a future that had never been part of the original narrative. Their existence itself complicated the story, stretching it beyond the moment of crime into the long aftermath of consequence. Guilt or innocence mattered less to the passing years than endurance did. Time does not care what you are remembered for. It only cares that you continue. The journalist, long removed from the case, once described Berlin 1991 as a lesson in scale. Not everything important announces itself loudly. Not every truth arrives intact. Some truths emerge only as distortions, visible only when compared against what we thought we knew. They said the fingerprint was not the most interesting part of the case. What mattered was what people did once they believed the case was over. Did they stop asking questions? Did they stop listening? Did they accept the story because it was comfortable or because it was sufficient? Berlin 1991 never answered those questions. It left them hanging, suspended between generations, passed down implicitly rather than argued openly. And that may be its most lasting contribution. Not a solved mystery, but a reminder that certainty is a resource to be spent carefully, because once it hardens, it becomes difficult to reshape without breaking something human in the process. The city moved on. It always does. But in databases, in lecture halls, in the instincts of investigators who hesitate one extra second before declaring a case closed, Berlin 1991 still exerts its gravity. A single fingerprint, once believed to rewrite history, now understood as one sentence in a much longer text, one that continues to be edited by those willing to read it slowly. Cold cases are not defined by their temperature. They are defined by what they teach us about patience, about limits, about the difference between knowing and understanding. And as Berlin 1991 faded fully into that category, it left behind not a solution to admire, but a posture to adopt. Lean forward. Question gently.
Conclude carefully.
Because somewhere, in some future case, another fingerprint will appear, clean and convincing and full of promise, and the memory of Berlin 1991 will whisper just loudly enough to be heard. This will end something, but it will not end everything, and what you choose to do with what remains will matter long after the